I'm the trash man. I come out, I throw trash all over the ring.
Are you a fan of trash content? Well, you've come to the right place. When I first made a video on Space Age, it felt like I still hadn't seen all that the planets had to offer, and what better way than making it as painful as possible. Also, people complained when I solved Fulgora using nothing but logistics bots. And so that's why we're going to be starting on Fulgora and using nothing but the trash there to beat the entire game. Obviously, the game wasn't really balanced with this in mind, so there are a few things I'll need to cheat in, and here's the first one. Ordinarily, when you first break a Fulgoran Vault Ruin, you'll be rewarded with the Recycler recipe, but not here, and that's because technically the Fulgora planet discovery research is a prerequisite. It's completely impossible to do anything here without these, so I've got to cheat that research in. It's not like it's unreasonable considering, you know, I'm already on Fulgora. I'd say it's pretty safe to say that I've discovered it. Well, now I can start digging up these ruins for some starting supplies, but there's another snag. As of version 2.0, wooden power poles are now locked behind electronics research, and electronics research requires you to smelt 10 copper plates. Except, I'm on a planet that has absolutely zero access to copper ore anywhere, and so this is also impossible and needs to be cheated in. I'm only doing this for when it's absolutely necessary to progress, and in my defense, this would have been no issue in 1.0. Alright, with that out of the way, I can finally get started. First order of business is to mine some more of these ruins to get the supplies necessary to make our first recyclers, as well as smelting some of the stone into the bricks necessary to make lightning collectors. The ocean here is made out of oil, so get any ideas of steam power out of your heads. The only source of power here are the frequent lightning storms that roll in every night, and I'm not sure if you've realized, but while I might be able to make small wooden power poles, they take wood, and I don't see many trees around, do you? The game starts you out with one piece of wood, but that's only enough to make 2 power poles, so this is what I've got to work with until I manage to research medium power poles, which with this setup is non-trivial, as you'll see. Those of you who have been on Fulgora before might notice something I'm missing. Yeah, usually when you land on this planet, you've got accumulators to hold the energy from the lightning strikes, so not only am I limited to harvesting power in this tiny area on account of only having 2 power poles, but every lightning bolt will only power up the network for like 2 seconds after it strikes. Fortunately, I can sort through scrap by hand, but the only way to get the copper plates necessary to make the red science on this planet is to break down things like the low-density structures or circuits that come from scrap, which again requires waiting on lightning strikes and recyclers. Once I've gotten at least a few copper plates to work with, I can start making some automation science by hand. Obviously the highest priority are those medium power poles, but look at what I've got to work with. While I might be able to craft science by hand, actually researching it requires labs and therefore electricity. And so I'm stuck here staring at these labs, waiting for night to come and to research logistics science one lightning strike at a time. That leaves me with plenty of free time to sift through all the trash by hand and stock up my supplies. This is the first time I've ever felt genuinely grateful for burner mining drills. It's amazing, they don't require electricity and so I can actually mine outside the area of my pathetic power network. After handcrafting all the science, I power through logistics science research, steel processing, and automation to unlock the ability to research those power poles. That might not sound so bad, but the earlier researches only took 5 seconds per bottle, while this one takes 30 seconds, so not only is it 120 bottles of red and green, but it's also 30 seconds each, and when my labs only work intermittently at night, I'm sure you can do the math. I've done a lot of things in Factorio, and I can confidently say that this is the first time that my progress has ever been limited by RNG. Only the lightning bolts that strike my little area of collectors here will give me any power, so I've just got to sit in the corner sifting through heaps of trash by hand while lightning bolts strike everywhere but my collectors. I added a few more labs, but I didn't do complete lab coverage because I wanted to keep recycling processing units for the green circuits, which are necessary to make stuff like inserters and miners. After nearly 2 hours and 30 minutes, I have finally gotten medium power poles. You cannot imagine my relief at crafting these things. I've got all the steel from recycling scrap, and so I immediately start running power lines all over my little island here. While I may not have accumulators yet, I can at least pretend that I've got a functional power grid by harvesting so much lightning that it appears continuous, at least at night. And since the lightning strikes carry so much energy, there's basically no overhead on buildings, and so with the power of power poles, I can make up for my intermittent power by simply making 4 times as many buildings as I'd need otherwise. I can also make some dirty automation for scrap recycling so I can finally stop doing it by hand like some kind of peasant. Just look at all that lightning I'm collecting. Finally, it feels like we're getting somewhere. We're still not ready for actual automation, but like I said, what I lose in reliable power I can make up with in simple scale, and so here's a bunch of assemblers that I'll be hand-feeding. It's only one step away from hand crafting, but it's much faster, and with that I can feed it into a bunch more labs. It's a little bit better than my old setup. So now our goal are those sweet, sweet accumulators, but compared to medium power poles, there's a lot of research we've got to churn through first. Even though we already get batteries from recycling scrap, actually researching the ability to use them requires going down the entire oil processing tech tree. But while that works, I've actually got some free time for once and can start stripping another island. It's good for supplies in the now, but I'll probably want to put something here in the future, so might as well clean it up while I've got the time. There's something about the factory whirring to life every time it gets struck by lightning, only to die moments later, that's cosmically funny to me. I mean, imagine if Frankenstein's monster tried to get off the table and immediately face-planted. Well, anyway, we've reached another roadblock. It's those damn trigger techs again. Before version 2.0, you could just research this stuff normally, but now I've got to actually pump crude oil in order to unlock the research instead of just using science packs. And despite being a literal ocean of heavy oil, there are no oil wells on Fulgora, so this is impossible. As soon as I convince the game that I know what oil is, I can start to research on sulfur and then on batteries. Reminder that my personal record for beating the base game is about 4 hours, and we're getting close to that just trying to research accumulators. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, I can actually start the research on those accumulators. I am so excited I accidentally vomit a bunch of scrap onto the ground. I am sick of crafting inserters and belts by hand, but after making the 150 necessary to craft all the science packs, it's only a matter of time. And at long last, I am finally allowed to play the game normally. These accumulators just take some iron and batteries to craft. Now, instead of needing to wait for a short burst of power, I can capture the whole lightning strike in these batteries and dole it out over time. Each one of these accumulators can store 5 megajoules, and so with enough of them, I can maintain power all the way into the day even when there's no lightning. I rebuild the science, and it's still hand-fed, but at least this time I only need to place circuits and gears in these boxes to get the science instead of dropping inserters into each assembler. It's a start. The main reason to do it like this is because I can easily sort out the ingredients using my inventory. After all of this, it's time to actually introduce the main challenge of Fulgora. All your resources come in the form of scrap, and breaking down scrap provides you with a chance to get 12 different items. In order of probability: gears, solid fuel, concrete, ice, stone, steel, batteries, cables, red circuits, blue circuits, low-density structures, and holmium ore. Compared to the rest of the game, Fulgora is completely backwards, because instead of starting from things like iron and copper to make blue circuits, you break down things like blue circuits to make iron and copper. As you might imagine, when you want to make something like red science, it's a little annoying when there's heaps of unwanted garbage that you've got to sift through. 2 miners will roughly keep pace with a single recycler. Technically, it'll only keep it running 80% of the time, but with 2 levels of mining productivity, that'll go up to 96%. I'm doing direct insertion, partially because I'm too lazy to use belts and inserters, but mostly because there's not a lot of space available on this little island, and this is more compact. Anyway, I've got this sort of thing, and as you can see, there's garbage absolutely everywhere. It's a lot to deal with, but at this stage of the game, I can just get rid of half of these. I'm sort of theory crafting ways to deal with this scrap, and this is my first attempt. I've just got an inserter filtered to one kind of item I want to get rid of, and a belt set to freeze if it detects that item on top of it. Ideally, the items are spaced out enough that the inserter will grab it before it stops the whole belt, but if it tries to sneak past the inserter, the whole belt will freeze until it's gone. It's slightly superior to using filter splitters because you can do it with only 1 tile instead of 2, even though I used 2 here anyway, but it doesn't feel sufficiently scalable. Anyway, when all I'm going for is chemical science, I don't really need stone, concrete, fuel, ice, batteries, and I certainly don't need holmium ore. That narrows it down to a nice clean 6 items left over. I'm just going to stash these in chests. I'll need to manually empty them out, but this is just my starter trash. Time to deconstruct all of this for the 3rd time! In order to make red and green science actually automated, I'll need iron plates, gears, circuits, and copper plates, but that's it. The iron plates will mostly come from recycling gears, which are the most abundant resource from scrap. I've decided to do it using a sushi belt because at this scale it seems the easiest option. I'll grab the gears off the line with these filtered inserters that will then turn on or off depending on whether we've got enough on the sushi belt. These recyclers will break down blue circuits to get the green circuits, turn gears into iron plates, and the last one will break down LDS for copper. I can also get iron plates from further breaking down the green circuits or batteries, but this is the most expedient. The problem is that leaves me with red circuits, plastic, and steel as trash on the belts, so I've got to make another part of the sushi belt dedicated to taking those unwanted items off. I can use the same trick as before with the underground belts and filtered inserters. The plastic from the LDS is actually completely worthless, so I'm just going to destroy it, but the rest will go back onto the main belt. As long as I keep this belt topped off with those 3 items, the belt and inserter assemblers will be able to make the ingredients for green science and then drop them on the sushi belt. I've just got to make sure to attach the inserters that are dropping the items onto the belt to turn them off if there's already enough so that they don't overfill it. That, plus an extra set of inserters to take off the science, is our mostly fully automated science. I say mostly because there's still all that trash to deal with, and the only way to keep the goods flowing is to continually get rid of all the unwanted stuff. Best I can do right now is just stash them in a chest. The trash must flow. If you take one thing away from this exercise, it's that. Anyway, I take this time to try and turn any spare gears into belts, undergrounds, and splitters. Getting early automation on logistics items makes the game significantly less painful, and it also lets me make some red belts, which are great for making up for the fact that sushi belts are awful. At least this design is relatively compact. Fulgora does not make building on these islands easy. It's not much, but it's my base, and it's not bad for being made out of trash. While I research all the things necessary for chemical science, I take a drive around the oil ocean. It's worth pointing out that the oil makes you slow, and even cars struggle to get you between islands quickly. I've got to scout out because the shapes of these islands will dictate how my future bases will look, but that's a long ways off yet. Normally advanced circuits are the biggest hurdle for chemical science, but I've already got those, so no issue there. The engine units, however, are much more annoying. We get steel and gears for free, but to make the pipes they take, I first need to break down the gears into iron plates and then turn them into pipes. Not the worst, but with sushi belts, any extra step is extra headache. Just like the other one, I've got to hook up all of the inserters so that they won't oversaturate the belt and only keep it topped up. But once I've got that set up, that's 2/3 of chemical science done. To make it less painful, I'm going to transfer the finished engines to another sushi belt, and then I just need to snag the advanced circuits from the trash belt. I've got this belt set up to deactivate if there's too many on the sushi belt. Okay, about that last ingredient. It's sulfur, and guess what that takes? Water and petroleum gas. Well, that's no problem. The ocean might be made from heavy oil, but we can crack that down to light oil and then that into petroleum gas with just some water. We can get the water from melting all that ice we've been getting from scrap, except, you need chemical science to research advanced oil processing and space science to get ice melting. You know, way back in the day, we just got advanced oil processing from the start, but we'll need to unlock these recipes with the console. This is the last time, however. It's all smooth sailing from here. Anyway, since heavy oil is infinite and we're making way more ice than we need, this whole process is basically free, and so it's just a matter of making the cracking plants and feeding that into a sulfur plant that will populate the chem science carousel. The pipes are actually the most annoying part of this because of how time-consuming it is to manually crunch the gears to make the iron they take. The sooner we can get automated supplies, the better. Regardless, that's mostly automated chemical science on a tiny little trash island. It's a far cry from our pitiful start rejoicing over every lightning bolt. Turns out, with this amount of scrap recycling, when I'm running science, I don't have any gears left over with to actually make belts. I am tired of having no supplies, but this one island isn't big enough to fit anything, so I drive over to that other island that I already cleared off and start setting up another mine. No more direct insertion because I actually want as much mining coverage as possible, but the general ratio of 1 recycler for every 2 miners still stands. Just like last time, I want to clear off half the scrap yields since they're mostly worthless for this application. I'm using the inserter and underground trick again, but this time I want to use it for multiple items. I was hoping that I could combine it with the belt freezing tech that'll ensure that everything gets cleaned off since I've got some external combinator to read if any of the forbidden items are present and send a signal to stop the belts, but as expected, the fast inserters can't grab the items even though they get paused right at the beginning. Since I can't wire up undergrounds, this just isn't enough, so I need to relent and use long-handed inserters, at least for the bottom portion. They're a lot slower, so again this design needs some work, but it should be good enough. Instead of storing them in chests, anything unwanted just gets shredded into oblivion by the recyclers so that it won't lock up the supply build. That still leaves me with a bunch of trash to sort through, but the first one I'll get rid of is batteries. I only want them for accumulators so I can get them out of the way fairly quickly. Any excess batteries will be shredded to make iron plates. It also makes copper, but that's mostly useless here, so it also gets shredded. The easiest way to try and make this sane is to separate everything onto its own belt. The output of this is fairly low, so I can achieve that with just some filter splitters for each item. But this is a good introduction to the true challenge of Fulgoran bases. I want a belt for red and blue circuits, but I also need green circuits, so I've got to make a separate thing that breaks down reds and blues to get them. But those also make byproducts I don't want, so I've got to take care of those too. Except the green circuits might overflow, so I've got to break those down as well. But they make iron plates, so it would be a waste to not feed those into an iron belt. But the copper cables are useless, so I need to recycle those into plates and then shred those into nothing. And all of this needs to continually destroy any excess because one item getting backed up causes the entire thing to break. Basically, what I'm saying is that it quickly becomes an incomprehensible mess where you're forced to carefully manage this spiderweb of outputs and belts destroying things and feeding into each other so that the trash will continue to flow. The actual construction of this supply island isn't really important because it's a spaghetti nightmare, but really it's mostly for inserters, assemblers, power poles, miners, belts, and even lights. There's a lot more I wanted to add, but I ran out of space faster than I expected, so only the most important things are here. I'm also making all the modules, because when circuits are so free that they actually become waste products, you might as well. This extra space in the middle is reserved for something truly special. I don't want to talk about how I managed to finagle concrete all the way down here after realizing that it's not totally a waste product, nor how I managed to make refined concrete in this mess. I am trapped on these tiny islands, and the only hope for a true base lies in trains, and that means elevated rails. I don't have them researched yet, as they take purple science, but they are probably the most important thing that this island will make. Fulgura bases certainly have a chaotic quality to them. There's some issues, like realizing that getting rid of all the low-density structures requires more than one recycler, but it's functional enough. Since I've cleared off that old belt build, I can fill this space with miners. This starter island should have just enough space for me to get production and utility science up. Scrap mines twice as fast compared to something like iron ore, so just this is enough to fully saturate a red belt. Actually getting the belt through the base into the empty area is a bit of a challenge, but I'm a spaghetti veteran at this point. That'll come down here and feed some more recyclers. Building with one lane of red belts makes this much easier because I can just filter splitter directly into some recycling units to get rid of all the trash. Also, outputting onto a belt that just reinserts the leftovers is the most space-efficient way to do it. I feel like I'm really starting to understand the scrap, because the time that it takes to recycle an item is 1/16th the time that it takes to make it. That means something like steel will take more recyclers to destroy than the same amount of iron plates would. The biggest example of this is concrete, and that's because even though that the concrete recipe takes 10 seconds to make 10 concrete, destroying a single piece of concrete still behaves as if its crafting time is 10 seconds, so it takes significantly longer. That's why it's getting 3 recyclers dedicated to it. Remember, the trash must flow, and another issue is that if you don't have enough space on the belt that the recyclers are trying to output onto, their internal inventories will start clogging up. That means that when space does appear, it'll spit out nothing but iron gears all at once instead of the nice distribution that we want. If an avalanche of one item comes out all at once, it'll overwhelm the recyclers that try to get rid of it and then cause the whole belt to back up again, making this harmonic cycle of clogged trash. I actually have a use for stone since I'm going to be making purple science, so I'll be needing bricks and rails. I'll also need green circuits again to make the productivity modules as well as the robot frames for yellow science later. I actually just remembered that concrete is made from bricks, and so recycling concrete is a great way to get the bricks for the electric furnaces, so I switch up the recycling design a bit. This thing is already an incomprehensible mess, but that's just Fulgura gaming. I need some iron to make the sticks necessary for the rails, but I'll also need them for the pipes and the engine units. It's not much, but this will eventually make purple science just as soon as the belts aren't permanently clogged. Like I said, I'll need to make some more engines to make the electric engines and then robot frames. The nice thing about Fulgura is that the entire ocean is made out of heavy oil, so making the lubricant necessary is as easy as placing down a single offshore pump and a chemical plant. Beyond just yellow science, it'll be nice to have these robot frames for construction robots. Another nice thing about Fulgura is that simply by mining scrap, you've got 2/3 of yellow science finished already. And with those robot frames, all I've got to do is plug in the processing units and low-density structures. It's still pretty hungry down here, so since all these things are worthless in the red, green, and blue builds, I managed to route all the extra stuff down here to supplement the supply. Then I need to make an extra thing to try and eliminate any excess gears to keep the trash flowing, also making some spare steel in the process. And all that's left is to somehow get all this science all the way to the labs. I take a quick trip beneath a science build, and it does require some belt weaving, but eventually I do get them mostly into the labs. And there's all the sciences. You might notice that there's no military science, and usually I'm joking when I say military science doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist. You need coal to make the grenades that it takes, and there is absolutely no way to get coal on Fulgura, so this is everything for now. Also, I'm realizing that even with recycling concrete for bricks, the amount of stone that scrap produces isn't enough to keep the purple signs flowing at the same rate as everything else, so that's definitely going to be a challenge in the future. But at last, I can build those elevated rails. Hooray! This is the first major step in creating a real base. It doesn't really come across in the video, but this base is pretty bad. It does exactly what I needed it to do, but it needs constant babysitting. I've got to empty out the boxes, and due to the space limitations, I can't fully handle overflows of certain items. I'll be glad to be done with it, and thankfully that's what's coming up next. First, though, I want construction bots. I can't make Power Armor Mark II because there's no military science, nor a personal reactor because there's no uranium on this planet, but solar panels are good enough. At least that's what I'd say if I didn't just remember that the solar on Fulgor is only 20% that of Nauvis, so my dreams of wearing exoskeletons are completely crushed. I've got to slow walk forever. I'll have a hard enough time simply charging up my roboports, so I'm adding extra batteries in the hopes that they'll slowly fill up enough of a buffer while I'm not building. Anyway, the Fulgoran landscape is generally split up into 3 categories, 4 if you count the ocean, I guess. But it's tiny scrap islands, medium-sized empty islands, and large continents. Up until now, we've been stuck to the tiny scrap islands, but with elevated rails, it's now possible to transport scrap from island to island. That means I can make these little stations that pick up scrap from one of the scrap islands, then move it to a bigger one. Fittingly, there's trash on top of the trash that I've got to clean up first, but construction bots make that much less painful. Once it's all cleaned up, it's time to start placing down some miners. You might recognize this design, as it's the most efficient way to cover resources with miners, leaving as little space as possible. This is important here because these patches are small but practically infinite, so the more miners I can fit onto them, the better. The only downside is that they're a little expensive on the underground belts, but my supply island has me covered well enough. One problem with these scrap islands is that they are so small it's actually difficult to even fit the train stations on them, and that's because we need room for the ramp that takes them down from over the oil ocean and then back up again while still fitting enough room to load the trains. Because of this restriction, I'm going for 1-2 trains. You can assuage this a bit by making the trains double-headed so that you only need one ramp to go in or out, but the simplest 1-1-1 train weighs 5,000 compared to the 4,000 of a 1-2. So not only does it have half the storage capacity, but it takes even longer to accelerate, and I do care about acceleration speed a bit, as you'll soon see. These belt balancers are the only blueprints that I've got zero shame over stealing from someone else. That'll load up all 4 cargo wagons equally. One positive thing about Fulgora, power is just there in the air, and so it doesn't matter that I'm miles away from my base. One negative thing about Fulgora is that to get to that power, I've got to spam accumulators and lightning rods everywhere. At least you don't need that many for just a handful of miners, unless I get ambitious and start filling these things with modules. So that's one island conquered, and that'll be enough for me to move on to the real base stage of the game. That big island up there looks like a nice spot. It's still restrictive, but it's like 10 times bigger than the islands I've been using up until now. I'll set up the drop-off station and worry about actually hooking it up later. I'm going with 4 stops, and I'd like to say how much I love the new rails for making my station designs much more dynamic. 8 belts of scrap should be sufficiently ambitious for now, and configured properly, these, bulk inserters will saturate the whole belt. Yeah, it's still hard for me to not call them stack inserters. And come on, I can't place this single piece of rail here even though there's supports everywhere? Whatever. All the trains will go up this ramp and head back to the mines, while the scrap will continue on to the recyclers. This much scrap will require many recyclers. As tempting as it is to just place them all in a big line, I'm leaving space between every 2 just in case I wanted to add beacons later. Unlikely, but it won't hurt it. I also add another space here so that I can switch sides of the belt lanes, seeing as otherwise the recyclers would only fill up half of the belt. This will take care of 2 lanes, but I've got 8, so I've got to paste this 3 more times. Even with the most pathetic solar power, personal robots are amazing. I'll just go ahead and mention now that I accidentally messed up the ratio and made 25% more recyclers than the belts can feed, but whatever, it'll work. The space restriction means that I've got to handle lanes 7 and 8 down here, but part of me likes the limits. Some people flip their lid when a single cliff blocks their 16-lane smelting blueprint, but I appreciate how it forces you to approach the design a little bit differently every time. Regardless, 8 lanes of scrap will turn into 8 lanes of trash, and it's up to us to turn that into something useful again. But first I've got to actually hook this mine up. I love how you can automatically plan rails all along the map, but the journey from here to there is so convoluted that even the game's giving up. It's worth pointing out that the oil ocean is made up of shallow and deep areas. I can only build supports on the shallow portions, and so this route is going to be a little windy. You'll eventually unlock the ability to build over the deep ocean too, but that's a long ways away, for reasons I'll explain later. Anyway, I can just hook this thing up, and now it's good to go. Yes, I'm doing bidirectional rails, and that's because it means I only need to plan out one insane circuitous route through the oil ocean, instead of two. I would generally recommend against bidirectional rails, but when you're me, you can get away with this stuff. That being said, the only way that it can work automatically is if the entire section from the mine to the drop-off can only allow one train at a time. And while that's not the biggest issue, I can help it out a little bit. This weird split thing will allow it to retain its bidirectionality while still allowing trains a place to stop in the middle of the rails. 2 lanes can go north and 2 lanes can go south. This way, trains can at least get this far before needing to wait for the main line to clear. And now that I've built it once, I can just paste another one up here by the drop-off area, since it's another high-volume location. Then I've just got to attach the rail here, and yeah, that's perfect. As you can see, for this trash run, I've really been trying to adopt the trash mindset. Now let's watch our beautiful train's journey to the trash heap. Have I ever mentioned that I love the sound the trains make when they're driving on the elevated rails? And it slots nicely into the station and starts dropping off our scrap. I've got to detach the belts because I really don't want it to start saturating the belts with garbage just yet. At least we can pretend it's full of trash. And here you can see my little sighting area in action. Being able to get up to speed from a dead stop is why I cared a little bit more about acceleration this time. Bask in the majesty of my trainomancy. And now I'll fill this place up with accumulators. I appreciate how Fulgor encourages these compact designs and then lets you fill up everything else with accumulators. If you're not using all your space, you're doing it wrong. I'm not going to be turning anything on for quite a while, but this is mostly so I won't need to be staring at the flashing "no power" warning the entire time. So after thinking long and hard about how I'm going to sort things off of 8 different lanes, I've come to the conclusion that my underground belts and filtered inserters are still the best option. That whole thing about freezing the belt if something gets past, yeah, I've realized that the inserters are good enough on their own that they barely let anything through anyway, and what does get away I can just break down indiscriminately at the end of the belt with no small loss. That being said, just like last time, I'm going to try and get rid of the easy stuff first, with the easiest being ice. The only thing I've got to do with it is melt it, but with this much scrap, I will need a decent amount of production to actually melt all that ice. I do kind of wish that the icons of things in alt mode were dithered a bit when they're underneath elevated rails, because I rip up this whole thing and move it 2 tiles up simply because I don't like how they intersect with the train tracks. I'm a simple man. If you're in the way of me looking at my trains, you're the problem that needs to be solved. Water is great because it's super easy to make a giant buffer of it using tanks, and if that somehow overflows, I've got some recyclers down here to destroy any excess ice. I made this random train stop to pick up water just in case I wanted to deliver it to a different island, but thinking back on it, this was mostly a waste of time. Also, I have the ability to make blue belts, but there's not enough room here, so I'm forced to make just the undergrounds. The main purpose of all of this water is for creating rocket fuel, which is the only use for the metric tons of solid fuel that the scrap spits out. It's funny because even if the scrap didn't already make more than we could ever use, you can just turn the oil ocean directly into infinite amounts of solid fuel. Anyway, rocket fuel isn't used in any science anymore, but this is space age. It's used by the wagon loads to build rockets and ship things into space, and since this is the trash run, I'm going to be shipping a lot of things to space, so this is important. Just like we cracked down heavy oil to make petroleum gas for the sulfur, all we've got to do is use some of that water to crack it down to light oil. I have absolutely no idea about the ratios, so I'm just going to fill out this entire space with chemical plants and assume that's enough. The light oil demand of rocket fuel is next to nothing anyway. Likewise the sulfur demand, since we don't even need to make sulfuric acid here thanks to the batteries and processing units already being products of scrap. I set up this train station for sulfur and rocket fuel since I'm still entertaining the idea of making this whole thing scalable. Will they ever get used? Who knows? Now I know I'm probably going to have loads of leftover fuel and water, so I'm thinking about what if I turned it all into steam and boiled it for excess power. It's slightly better than just recycling it, right? I have no idea, but we're gonna find out. Maybe if I get really ambitious, I could store it all as steam and set it up to release when the accumulators drop too low as backup power, but I'm pretty sure the amount of lightning available on this big island is more than enough. At least it looks kind of cool. That's 2 out of the 12 items dealt with, and another easy one is holmium ore. I'm getting to the point where I might actually want this stuff, but I'm just going to send it over here to be put onto a train, and if it fills up the chests, any excess will be destroyed. Thinking back, I'm not sure why I put the ore on the train, since it would have been a million times easier to make the holmium solution first and then ship that, since that's the only use for holmium ore anyway, but you live and you learn. The next thing to be dealt with is concrete. Again, it takes quite a while to recycle this stuff compared to everything else, so it'll take a good number of recyclers. I've got to design this thing to handle when all 160 scrap recyclers are up and running. And unfortunately, since I messed up that ratio earlier, I ended up building 25% more than I needed here as well. The main purpose of concrete is, again, recycling it into bricks so that we can make purple science out of it. Also, here I am switching over that one assembler from undergrounds to regular belts after stocking up a few hundred. Here's where it gets a little bit more complexicated. I've got to make green circuits again, and that means breaking down red and blue circuits. Because the trash must flow, I need to ensure that excess reds and blues will always be broken down, so this isn't something I can just do when I need green circuits. Because of that, I've got to make the red circuit output of the blue circuit recyclers feed into the red circuit recyclers, and the green circuit output of the reds meet up with the green output of the blues. Then I've got to get rid of excess copper cable and plastic, and it's a mess. From watching the yellow science build in my starter base, I'm a little concerned that I won't have enough LDS to both meet the demands of yellow science and also build the thousands of rockets that I'm going to be sending. So I'm trying to set up some extra assemblers that will consume the plastic and copper output of the circuit recycling to make some extra LDS on the side. It also means I'll need to pull the steel line off over here. In all of my other videos, you're seeing the end result of me already having played way too much Factorio, but here I'm still feeling things out. Anything that doesn't get made into LDS should be destroyed, and that'll be taken care of over here. Already, I've got the makings of a main bus, and it's getting pretty crowded in here. Then, even though I made a thing that builds LDS, I've got to make something else that destroys them. The difficulty is that not only do LDS have a long crafting time, which also means a long recycling time, but they also spit out 5 copper plates, 1 steel plate, and 1 plastic bar on average, so I've got to factor that in for the time to destroy all of those as well. But I've also got to feed those into the main line while only getting rid of the excess. It's tempting to just get rid of them entirely, but again, I'm unsure of how the resource demands will end up playing out, so I'm erring on the side of caution. Unfortunately, that caution results in these inelegant designs. That's all I need for the LDS, so that's another product dealt with. Batteries are used in yellow science and later electromagnetic science, but apart from that, they're mostly useless and can be shredded for their iron and copper plates. The key is to set up every item in such a way that they'll all be sorted onto their appropriate belt while any excess is also destroyed. The concrete also spits out a trace amount of iron ore. I decided to turn those into plates, but I can say that this wasn't worth the effort and you're better off just destroying them all. Believe it or not, but there's only 2 items left that need to be dealt with. That's stone and gears. The gears will use 2 rows of long-handed inserters, because they are so abundant they'll actually need 2 lanes to empty out the trash belt. The stone is needed to make the rails for purple science, as well as the holmium solution for electromagnetic science, but anything extra can be turned into bricks, and anything extra can be destroyed. Likewise, I'll need to turn any excess gears into plates, and any extra plates into nothingness. Gears have a crafting time of 0.5 seconds, so they recycle extremely quickly. That's everything, but since there's a chance that some things might get past the inserters, I've got to make this thing at the end of the belts that tries to annihilate everything indiscriminately. I try to handle the overflows of each item in their respective lanes, but this will be a good backup measure. The only thing that can clog up at this point are green circuits, so once again I've got to deal with those. It was so clean when we were making rocket fuel, but it's all turned into a mess again, and my end goal is what? To just turn it into a main bus? There's this instinct gnawing at me that this shouldn't need to be so horrible. It feels like there's this elegant solution out there to all of this, but I'm just too blind to see it yet. The way I'm sorting the trash from the main belt feels nearly optimal, but it's everything after that that turns into this tangled mess. I felt like this the moment I tried to shred the blue circuits, but I chose not to act on it because analysis paralysis is even worse than an inefficient design. Regardless of how I feel about it, it'll at least be functional. And my god, this river of trash is absolutely beautiful. It's almost as beautiful as my 30-lane sushi bus. But this is the first glimpse at the trash monster that will conquer the solar system. I'm not going to sweat the design too much at this point, because I'll probably end up rebuilding a lot of the base once I get the better buildings from Vulcanus, but this should be enough to bootstrap me onto the other planets. There's a couple kinks I've got to work out, mostly with not having enough recyclers to handle the full flow, but you can see how everything is neatly sorted onto belts. At first I entertained the idea of having this whole island simply being the one to sort the trash before being loaded onto trains and assembled elsewhere, but after looking at the sheer amount of space it takes, I think I've got to nix that idea. I could fit the entire base in the space that these stations are taking alone. I also briefly considered some kind of deranged sushi train, but quickly banished that thought to the 17th hell dimension. Okay, so ordinarily at this stage, you'd end up making about 1 million assemblers to make all the circuits and low-density structures, but since we've already got all of those, all of these science builds will go up pretty quickly. The only raw resource that I'm really missing is engine units, but those aren't very complicated. The build is a little sloppy, but the genius of this run is that I can make anything as bad as I want, and I can just claim that it's thematic for the trash run. Regardless, the main consumer of engines is chemical science, and since we've already got everything we need to make those, all I've got to do is set up the assemblers. After playing Factorio for nearly 10 years, it still feels a little weird just having all 3 circuits from the start, but I am certainly not complaining. The red science is the easiest thing in the world since both of its ingredients are on the bus already, and the green science is a little more involved since I need to make belts and inserters, but not by much. The plates, gears, and greens are just a few dozen underground belts away. Now I've got to make the electric engines again. I've done this once before, so I'm sure you get the idea. It's the other use for those engine units, and really the only thing worth mentioning is that this island is so covered with cliffs I've got to go all the way over here just to slap down an offshore pump. Anyway, that's all I'm missing for yellow science, and that leaves purple science. Production science is the most involved of all the sciences here because it's the only one that isn't already half built just from the scrap. You do get advanced circuits for free, but everything else is pretty much the same. You've still got to make rails, furnaces, and productivity modules, but I've done this about 1 million times now and have the ratios engraved on my femur. Purple science is going to be the biggest roadblock for sure, since the steel and stone demand seem to outstrip everything else. It'll be even worse when it's competing with military science for stone bricks, but that still doesn't exist. For now. And just in case you've been wondering where I've been getting all of these Tier 3 assemblers from, I've just been handcrafting them for my infinite box of Tier 1 speed modules. All that's left to do now is set up the labs. I'm going to load all of the sciences onto a sushi belt, not only because it's thematic, but also because it's the easiest way to deal with it now that there's a billion different sciences I've got to shove into these things later. Thanks to the read all belts function of 2.0, this is pretty easy. When before you'd hook up a complicated memory cell that had to keep track of all this stuff, now you can just wire up the inserters directly and painlessly turn them on only when that item is low. There it is, all the basic sciences made for real this time, but there's still a handful of things I need to do around here. I realized it's a shame to be shredding all of those gears and wasting them. It's much better if that gear belt terminates into some recyclers that turn them into plates which can then be made into steel. When it comes to steel, it seems to be in a constant vacillation between way too much and not enough, usually depending on whether you're making purple science, so this will help it along. We're getting there, but after turning it on for a while, it's apparent that one scrap mine isn't anywhere near enough. Unlike somewhere normal where you can just build a massive buffer of resources and only make them as you need them, on Fulgora you want it to be running constantly. It's wasteful, but it's already waste to begin with, so who cares? Anyway, the point is, even if I'm not using it, the base will keep churning through all this scrap regardless. And it's an intended feature. Maybe later I'll make some kind of cutoff that stops feeding scrap if it detects that everything's full, but personally I think ever being in this situation where your base isn't doing anything useful is a skill issue. My personal roboports ran out of charge, and thanks to the awful solar on this planet, I had to finish up this thing by hand. How embarrassing. This island took a little finagling to fit the stations, but it worked out. My favorite part is a little loop-de-loop that the trains need to do because of how deep the ocean is everywhere. Back at base, it's time to start worrying about the rest of the game, and that means making all of the supplies for constructing space platforms. It uses a bunch of steel and copper, but since purple science is mostly brick limited, there should be enough extra even as we research more mining productivity. By the way, in Space Age, I highly recommend collecting a bunch of electric engines in a chest, because at 200 each, you're going to be very thankful you did every time you need to craft a new rocket silo. This isn't vanilla Factorio, where if you ever need more than one silo, you're definitely mega-basing. Here, standing up dozens of rockets is the norm, and that's why I've crafted these 4 silos to start with. I'm pretty sure I've said it before, but it's worth saying again. The best thing about Fulgora is that rockets are practically free, so I shouldn't have too many problems launching off hundreds of these. It does require me to bring the rocket fuel over here, and since I put it on a train, yeah, whatever. I could have just belted it here, but this makes me feel better. There we are, the first of many rockets. I've already got the space platform starter pack in my inventory, so up that goes shortly after. Now it's sitting in the void while I can start building the rest of it. The purpose of this space platform is going to be making the first space science. It's actually really easy, but I've got to get all the crushers and the grabbers up there first. So there's something I neglected to realize, and that's that we're in the space around Fulgora, and there's medium asteroids, and they keep battering my station. I've actually got to defend my space platforms here. That means I've got to make ammunition. Unlike my last space age run, I'm going to try and primarily defend my platforms with ammunition made on the ground of Fulgora. While I've decided that the space around Fulgora counts as Fulgora for my Fulgora maxing run, I still want to increase the demand on my ground station. Also, red ammo's nice. I give ammunition its own rocket silo, but my platform actually explodes before I can send any defenses to it. Well, it's not like it's difficult to make starter kits, but it still makes me feel a little silly. Okay, now I'm ready to build it. By the way, this is why even though we're on Fulgora, I automated solar panels a million hours ago. Now look at this. Look at this absolutely pathetic damage output. It's not something you usually think about, but I'm just now realizing how awful damage is when I don't have access to military science. Right now it's doing about a third of the damage it would be doing otherwise, which means it's consuming 3 times as much the ammo. I realized that just to keep this platform asteroid free would take a rocket firing around the clock to constantly resupply it with ammunition. Well, it does mean there's a lot more resources available in space because it can break apart the asteroids, but you hardly need anything for space science anyway. Speaking of space science, you grab the asteroid chunks, crush them, turn the ore into plates, then combine everything into an assembler to make it. It's not really that complicated, and you hardly need any assemblers to craft it. Just this 3 here will roughly make 80 science per minute. The ammo demand is actually so annoying that I decide it's best to just let the asteroids constantly crash into the platform. The cost of the repair packs is a fraction of the cost of the ammo. I actually do set the guns to filter to ice asteroids only because they're less abundant and more desirable. If you're wondering why it looks so weird, well, what did you expect from the trash run? I've got the landing pad right here, and now that the space science can go right into the labs, oh boy, we're really getting somewhere. You see, the genius of having 2 belts for the sushi science is that because one is longer than the other by necessity, using a splitter between them causes the sciences to naturally spread out. Also, as always, the Disco Science mod is necessary. With access to space science, I can research logistics chests as well as thrusters for my space platform, because as much as I love trash, I've got to go to the other planets at some point. And as much as it terrifies me, I've chosen Gleba for our first destination. I'd love to go to Vulcanus first, but the worms there are practically invincible considering I've got 0 military research. The main thing about preparing to go to the other planets is setting up a robust supply network. It's not that I don't love needing to slowly drive across an entire ocean of oil every time I want to pick up supplies, it's just probably for the best that I rebuild all the supply automation in a place that actually has room for it. Also, I've got my rocket silos here, and I want all of these things to be available to request into space. The entire philosophy behind this base was no logistics bots, but I'm making an exception for the rockets. You can handle space logistics with inserters, but you'd basically need a silo for every item, and if you need like 10 rockets of one item, it would take ages compared to the Logibots distributing everything automatically. Now that I think about it, you can read platform requests from the circuit connections of a rocket silo, so you could probably use filter inserters and have one silo capable of grabbing several different items from chests or belts, but I've already built my silos over there and I'm not moving them. Also, ordinarily at this point, I'd just use logistics chests to automatically handle the supplies, but I'm still avoiding Logibots as a matter of principle. Except for getting refined concrete over here. I'm not that principled. That's most everything. I shoved automation of some things like roboports elsewhere because I've given up on trying to make this base elegant. The moment I've mentally accepted this as just another starter base is the moment I stop caring. Also, I've got to automate belts for real this time. You get tons of gears from scrap, so if anything, this is just saving half of them from the recycling bin. It'll be nice not needing to use one assembler to make all the blue belts. Speaking of things that are basically free, here are some more modules. Tier 2 this time. Might as well use the excess circuits for something useful. And you might notice that there's no quality modules, and yeah, about that. More on that later, but I was wondering why my batteries were never charging until I realized that the passive drain of a single belt immunity equipment was outstripping the entire charging rate of my panels. Well, this base makes everything I need, but it's not quite up to snuff just yet, and so I'll need a third scrap mine. This island here can be reached by big electric poles, but not underground belts, so I'm like, might as well shove a million accumulators onto it. This should take care of all of the power needs for the foreseeable future, and maybe even beyond that as well. I've made another waiting area, but only 2 lanes this time, since this branch of the track will be lower traffic. The island itself is wide enough to easily fit the rails, and so it goes up pretty quickly. There's just something about these little outposts that makes me love them. I think it's the way that each one is a little unique, isolated, and tends to take up the whole space. It's like one of those little plastic buildings that you hooked up to all your Hot Wheels tracks, or something, I don't know. I'm going to be making many deliveries, so here's many rocket silos. I'll probably end up adding even more later, but this should cover it for now, because there's one final hurdle. I've got to make a space-worthy space platform. It's actually not as hard as you think, as long as you adhere to some basic principles, such as one ice melter being able to handle 2 oxidizers and 2 fuel plants. I'm not making this ship too ambitious, but you could probably tell that by now. If you want the profundities of space platform design, you can watch my first Space Age video, but it's enough to say that I'm going to make it go forwards by shooting asteroids before they can hit us and using their corpses to fuel my thrusters. That leaves me with enough time to point out that I'm not using quality in this run. It wasn't really relevant until now. Let's just say that the trash engineer doesn't know the meaning of quality, so it is thematic. It's not that I hate it, but it feels like it's something meant for optimizing larger bases. But when it comes to challenge runs, I think it's more interesting to need to plan larger builds and scale horizontally. Allowing me to make up for any design deficiencies by gambling for better buildings encourages some bad habits, I think. It's also more difficult this way, and that's what challenges are all about. However, as much as I'll miss quality power poles, there is only one thing I'm concerned about: asteroid collectors. Most everything is easy to live without, but asteroid collectors are the only thing that scales positively in like 3 different stats. Compared to normal collectors, a legendary one will have nearly 3 times the collection area, faster collection, and 6 arms compared to only 1. Most things with legendary status only have their most important stat multiplied by 2.5, but even ignoring everything but arms, that means that asteroid collectors scale 6 times on that alone. They are legitimately the only thing that feels like they were balanced explicitly for quality, and basically what I'm getting at is, I think making functional space platforms with these things will be quite the challenge indeed. Anyway, I'm gonna be bringing in most of my ammunition by rockets from Fulgora, but I put the ammo production on the platform anyway, because whatever. It's only yellow ammo, and I'm just shoving it into the hub to be used in case the red ammo runs out. It's a good contingency should it get stranded in hostile space, and it also makes it a little more interesting. And there we are, the space platform No One's Treasure, spreading the majesty of trash across the universe. Sadly, it's about time for this video to come to a close. We've got fully automated scrap, science, and all the supplies we'll need to set up our extraterrestrial bases. I was a little torn on how to handle future Space Age challenges, because doing it all in one video was a little rough for me, since I'd like to upload monthly, and so I'd usually split the larger ones up into multiple parts. Ultimately, I've decided to make this a 2-parter. I'm sort of treating this one like any other basic Factorio challenge, where it ends as soon as we launch a rocket, or in this case, a space platform, while the next one will be all the rest of Space Age. Oh yeah, almost forgot to thank my patrons. These kinds of challenges are a little tough thematically, since it's not like I can stay completely dedicated to trash when it comes time to make the other planet's science packs, but I'll do my best to at least keep them spiritually trash. Gleba is our first stop, and that's because I've got big plans for this place, or rather, what we can take from it, but I'll leave you in suspense. Let's just hope I can fend off the natives without any kind of military research for long enough to get it done. But with that, I'll see you next time to spread our message of garbage across the solar system, and potentially even further beyond.